Case 1. Robert Crimo III, the man responsible for the tragic attack. Robert Crimo III, then 23, presented an alarming and memorable image. His face and neck were covered in tattoos that seemed to be a personal declaration. Above his left eye, the word "awake" was boldly inked, while the number 47 sat near his right eye, an apparent code for a meaning known only to him. An elaborate flower design was wrapped around his neck, adding a dramatic flair, even when he attempted to hide it. Crimo frequently used his appearance, including his tattoos, makeup, and clothes, as a calculated tool, mixing personal style with symbols of menace. On the day of the violence, he wore women's clothing and makeup to hide his tattoos, allowing him to blend unnoticed into the crowd at the 4th of July parade in Highland Park, Illinois. Beneath this deceptive outward look lay a ruthless and fully calculated mindset. On July 4th, 2022, Crimo took a position on a rooftop with a semi-automatic rifle, looking down on the parade route. From there, he opened fire on the families and spectators celebrating Independence Day. The result was devastating. 7 people died and more than 40 others were injured, many with permanent damage. The victims included an 8-year-old boy left paralyzed and an 88-year-old man. The deceased were Catherine Goldstone, Jacqueline Sunheim, Stephen Strauss, Nicholas Toledo Zaragoza, Eduardo Uvaldo, and the married couple, Kevin and Irina McCarthy. Crimo's actions were deliberate and showed an utter indifference to human life and the pain inflicted on the community. He fled the scene after the shooting, leaving the weapon behind, but was captured hours later in nearby Wisconsin. His demeanor remained unrepentant in court. He even refused to attend portions of his sentencing hearing. Judge Victoria Rossetti condemned him, calling him irretrievably depraved, irreparably corrupt, and beyond any possibility of rehabilitation. Survivors and victims' family members delivered powerful emotional statements, sharing their horror and grief, and directly addressing Crimo as a coward and monster. Many wore buttons showing the faces of those who were killed, a poignant symbol to keep their memory alive. Crimo's ability to prepare for the attack was tragically enabled by his father, Robert Crimo Jr., who later admitted guilt for reckless conduct. The elder Crimo had signed the necessary gun owner's identification card for his son, who was only 19 at the time and too young to legally obtain the card on his own. In March 2025, Crimo pleaded guilty to 7 counts of murder and numerous counts of attempted murder. The judge sentenced him to 7 consecutive life sentences, plus 50 years for each attempted murder, guaranteeing he will never be free again to threaten the public. His tattoos, disguise, and meticulous planning were more than just superficial choices. They were a psychological blueprint, a public statement of his lethal intentions. His violence shattered a community, highlighting a frightening mix of fixation, planning, and random cruelty. Case 2. David Peterson. He was a living canvas of bigotry, his skin covered in hate. The letters WSP were tattooed on his neck, and Nazi symbols were spread across his chest, a constant walking sign of the extreme beliefs that drove him to commit 4 murders. At age 34, his dangerous obsession with white supremacy and violence exploded into a 10-day rampage across Washington, Oregon, and California, leaving behind a wake of death and terror. The violence started in his own home. His first victims were the people who should have been safe with him. David Peterson, his father, was shot and killed. Leslie Peterson, his stepmother, was brutally murdered. Her life ended in a flash of rage and deep betrayal. Family ties were completely destroyed in a single night. This was more than just murder. It was a violent, symbolic act. Person's rage and twisted ideas had finally found an outlet, and he was determined not to stop. Person fled with his girlfriend, Holly Ann Grigsby. They weren't simply escaping, they were actively pursuing a plan, a white supremacist goal to target Jewish community leaders. But they failed to find their intended targets. What followed was a string of carjackings, robberies, and cold-blooded killings meant to fund and equip their campaign. Looking for a place to hide, Person and Grigsby enlisted the help of Corey Wyatt and Kimberly Scott Wyatt. The Wyatts got pulled into their dark world, even helping push Person's stolen Jeep, which still held his father's body, over a cliff, a horrible sign of the destruction Person left at every turn. In Newport, Oregon, they crossed paths with Cody Faye Myers, a 19-year-old. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The young man was kidnapped, murdered, and dumped because Person and Grigsby wrongly believed he was Jewish. He wasn't. But to the couple, the truth made no difference. Their hatred was enough. With Myers dead, the pair drove south toward California. Their confessed plan was chilling. They wanted to kill more Jewish people. Before they could do that, they came across 53-year-old Reginald Allen Clark in Eureka, California. Clark was disabled, alone, and defenseless. Person and Grigsby saw him as a target, viewing him as a Negro degenerate. They shot him dead, stole his truck, and kept up their bloody flight. Their crime spree finally ended when police tracked them down in Eureka. Both were arrested, and their path of destruction was immediately halted. But even during the court process, Person showed no regret. At his sentencing hearing, he offered no apology, nor did he try to explain his crimes in personal terms. Instead, he used the moment to speak out against the U.S. government, attacking America's foreign policy and mocking the very system that was about to punish him. "I can only laugh wryly," Person scoffed, "that I sit here being sentenced for crimes for which the United States government has accused me." He ranted about politics, Israel, and American drones, anything except the lives he had brutally taken. Person faced the full punishment for his actions. He was sentenced to life without parole for the murders of Cody Myers and Reginald Clark, a sentence to be served at the same time as his prior life sentence for killing his father and stepmother. Grigsby, who played a role in every part of the spree, also received life without parole. Justice, which had been delayed by the horror of their crimes, finally caught up to them. Case 3. Bruce Whitehead. The life story of Bruce Whitehead isn't about a sudden breakdown. It's about the slow, terrible decay of a man who spent his life confined and, once free, unleashed the darkness he had hidden away. His tattoos were not simply drawings. They were his public statement. The word sacrifice was etched across his forehead. A huge spider crawled down his neck toward his jaw, with a smaller one near his ear, like a shadow that never left him. Close to his face, a single crying eye was inked, an unsettling symbol of pain that seemed to mock the tears of those he harmed. These were more than just decorations. They were a warning. His body held the history of a man who belonged outside of decent society. On December 10, 2022, Whitehead spotted his victim walking with friends on the Orange Blossom Trail in Orlando. She was just trying to get home. But Whitehead was skilled at appearing trustworthy just long enough to get close. She made the mistake of getting into his car, completely unaware she was driving straight into a horror show. He drove her to a hidden area, away from the streetlights and other people. There, his mask finally dropped. "If you scream, I'll kill you right here," he whispered repeatedly, a terrifying chant. What followed was purely evil. He brutally bit her flesh, trying to tear off a piece of her body with his teeth. When that failed, he pulled out a knife. She felt her skin rip beneath the blade. He burned her with a lit cigarette, pressing it into her bare skin. He forced her into humiliating acts, using violence to maintain absolute control. Finally, he attempted to stab her in the chest, an act of execution to finish what he had started. But she refused to surrender. One single thought kept her alive. "I cannot die tonight. I have to get back to my son." That fierce will to survive proved stronger than his desire to destroy her. When she spoke in court, a deep silence fell over the room. Her account was more impactful than any weapon. The sounds of her skin being ripped, the cigarette burns, the sheer terror of believing she would never see her child again. Whitehead himself even broke down in the courtroom, asking the judge for permission to apologize. The judge immediately refused, stating, "I will not subject her to you speaking to her in this courtroom." The jury returned a verdict in just 1 hour. Guilty of attempted murder, sexual battery, kidnapping, and robbery. Judge Diego Madrigal III delivered a powerful condemnation. "Your actions are cruel, they're vile, they're evil. You preyed on women you thought were weak, but they stood here strong and brave and told this court they will not be your victims anymore." The sentence was 4 life sentences plus extra years, guaranteeing he would never again be free. As the judge delivered his fate, Whitehead asked to be placed in protective custody. He admitted that even inside the prison system, he was marked. The nature of his crimes and his infamous tattoos meant that death was waiting for him, either by time or by the hands of other inmates. "I've gotten death threats from the street," he told the court. "It's game on." But for his victim, survival was the ultimate victory. She lived, she testified, and she ensured Bruce Whitehead would never terrify another woman again. He entered the courtroom with sacrifice carved on his forehead, and in the end, it was his own freedom that was sacrificed forever. Case 4. Pazuzu Ila Algarad, a man known as a figure of absolute darkness. He claimed to follow Satan, sharpened his teeth to wicked points, and rarely, if ever, washed. Instead of cleaning himself, he would rub grime all over his body as if it were a strange religious act, believing soap would weaken his spiritual shields. But his true covering wasn't just physical dirt, it was a deep, consuming evil. Born John Alexander Lawson in 1978, his early life was unstable and broken. He struggled with mental illness, specifically schizophrenia, and a severe fear of open spaces. His mother found it impossible to afford the help he needed, and his condition worsened until he was completely lost to it. Eventually, the original John Lawson vanished. In his place was Pazuzu Algarad, a new identity he took from an ancient evil spirit. Pazuzu turned his house into a breeding ground for terror. It became a magnet for those who were already lost, the addicted, the broken, and the homeless. Inside, there was no order, only complete and utter chaos. His followers engaged in horrific acts. They mutilated animals, smeared walls with blood, drank each other's blood, and constantly used drugs and had sex. They called this their ultimate freedom, but the people who lived nearby just called it a house of horrors. Yet, the shocking mess inside was nothing compared to the awful secrets hidden right outside. For years, people whispered about the terrible crimes Pazuzu and his girlfriends might have committed. In 2014, these fears were finally proven true. Two men, Joshua Wetzler and Tommy Dean Welch, who had been missing since 2009, were dug up from shallow graves in the backyard. Both had been shot in the head before being dumped like grim sacrifices to the dark being Pazuzu claimed to honor. He wasn't the only one involved. His fiancée, Amber Birch, was the one who shot Welch and helped bury him. Another fiancée, Crystal Matlock, also helped hide the evidence. These women weren't driven by love, but by violence. They were simply disciples in his reign of madness. In 2015, the house was declared uninhabitable and was completely torn down. But Pazuzu wasn't there to witness its destruction. Just days before Halloween, while locked inside his jail cell, he used a sharp object to cut his own arm and bled to death. His life of darkness and fear ended exactly as it began, alone, utterly consumed by his own demons. Case 5. Keenan Brown. He seemed built to scare people. The phrase, "Fear Allah," was inked right onto his forehead, and his entire face and head were covered in dark, jagged tattoo patterns. His neck featured a gruesome border of tiny skulls etched deeply into his skin. His whole appearance was like a terrifying announcement of who he was before he even said a word. Yet, the scariest part of his story wasn't his intimidating look. It was the intense violence he kept hidden inside. By May 2019, Brown was already known to police in Easton County, Michigan. He had a history of brutal violence. Years earlier, he had violently attacked a former girlfriend, choking her, cutting her with a knife, and threatening to bury her where she'd never be found. He served a little over 3 years in prison for that horrific crime. When he was released, he was supposed to remain under parole supervision until June 2019. Instead, he completely disappeared from his supervision and his life spun out of control. By the time officers finally caught up with him, he was in the middle of what investigators would later call a killing spree. It started with unsettling text messages he sent to another ex-girlfriend. "I love you, so I spared you," he wrote, adding cryptic comments that suggested she would soon understand what he meant. She immediately contacted the police. Police traced Brown to Interstate 69 late one night where he was driving. They pulled him over for what seemed like a routine traffic stop. However, once the deputies put him in handcuffs, Brown did something completely unexpected. He calmly took out his phone and showed them photos of 2 deceased women. One was 26-year-old Kaylee Ann Brock, who had been beaten to death in her own home. The second was 32-year-old Julianne Mooney, discovered hours later in a Meridian Township motel room. Both victims had been murdered after being hit multiple times with a heavy, blunt object. Brown stole their cell phones, a crucial detail that connected him to their last moments. Video surveillance later showed Brown and Mooney together the night she was killed. Authorities also found footage of Brown actually buying the weapons used in the attacks. When Ingham County Sheriff Scott Wigglesworth spoke to the public, he was blunt and clear. There's no doubt he was on a killing spree. His quick arrest likely saved several lives. Authorities later revealed that Brown had already targeted 2 other women as his next victims. Both women were quickly contacted and placed under protection.
They were saved only because deputies happened to pull Brown over before he could get to them. In court, Brown faced 2 charges of open murder, 2 counts of armed robbery, and a long list of prior crimes. His criminal record was extensive: home invasion, serious assault, domestic violence, and that haunting 2014 conviction where he choked a woman and promised to kill her before he was jailed. This time, however, there would be no second chance. The image of Keener and Brown is hard to forget. The face covered in tattoos, the disturbing calm as he showed the murder photos to the police, and his long history of brutal violence. But more terrifying than any of that is the realization of how much worse things could have been if the deputies hadn't stopped him that night. Brown wasn't just repeating his past violence, he was dramatically escalating it, and he clearly had no intention of ever stopping.
For close to 2 decades, Terence Trent Voss was a name that people in Salt Lake City dreaded. He belonged to the Bloods gang and was connected to a black mafia group responsible for drive-by shootings and murders that tormented communities for years. The signs of this life covered his body, ink art spreading across his skin, including snarling dogs tattooed on his neck, his entire being a map of violence. Before he hit his 30s, the Metro Gang Unit already considered him their most wanted criminal. Voss was much more than just a gang member. He was a career offender whose record of crime went all the way back to his teenage years. He faced charges for shootings, illegal weapons, assaults, and trying to hinder justice. Time and again, the charges would fall apart or plea deals would be made. Voss always ended up back on the street until May 1st, 2021, when his violence focused on someone close to him. Around 2 a.m., a vehicle crash was reported on Interstate 80 near 200 East. A bystander stopped to help. Inside the wrecked car lay Shandon Scott, 32 years old, and a mother of 2 with fatal injuries. She hadn't died from the collision, she had been shot. Voss, her boyfriend, was the driver. But instead of helping Shandon, he attempted to steal the witness's car before fleeing on foot. Officers found and captured him soon after in a church lot. Voss initially told the police that another person had fired the gun, but while he was in jail, the truth came out during a phone call. He confessed to shooting Shandon following an argument. Investigators believe she was first shot at a Mill Creek residence. Voss then put her in the car and drove away on the freeway, leading to the crash that left her dead inside. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He was charged with aggravated murder, weapons crimes, and obstruction. The jury's verdict was guilty, and his sentence was final: life in prison without the chance of parole. Her family and friends faced Voss during the court session. Shandon's daughter read a statement on behalf of her younger brother. "I hate you like a flame that will go out. You were supposed to love her. You were supposed to protect her." A friend of Shandon's voiced an even stronger desire. "I hope when he does die, he dies with his eyes open and Shandon is looking dead in his face." Voss cried in court, but the prosecutors dismissed his tears as just an act. "Those crocodile tears mean nothing," they stated. Even in his apology, Voss refused to fully accept blame. Instead, he pointed the finger at Shandon, claiming, "We danced with the devil, and that is what happened." He then lashed out at the judge, accusing him of siding with the prosecution and misusing his authority. Terence T-Bone, the gang member, the tattooed enforcer, and now a convicted murderer. For years, Salt Lake had known him as a threat because of shootings and assaults. But it was his final act, the murder of his girlfriend, left to die in a wreck, that sealed his fate.
Life in prison with no possibility of release. For Voss, his life on the streets is finished. For Shandon's family, justice was served. But it was too late.
Case 7. Decarlos Brown Jr., a man of 34, projected a silent menace. Tall and edgy, his eyes seemed to constantly search for a fight that wasn't there. His face was a roadmap of a hard life spent in and out of jail for various crimes, including armed robbery and theft. Brown was homeless, struggling with mental illness, and effectively abandoned by a system that couldn't handle him. He was a disaster waiting to happen. In March 2025, the disaster arrived. On a Charlotte light rail car, people were riding quietly. Among them was Irina Zaretska, a 23-year-old Ukrainian refugee who, just 3 years prior, had escaped the horrors of war with her family. Irina was an artist, described by those who knew her as full of life and joy, happiest with her family nearby. She thought she'd found safety and a fresh start in the United States. That feeling of security was instantly crushed. Security cameras showed Brown approaching the back of her seat. Without a sound or a moment's pause, he pulled out a knife and repeatedly stabbed Irina in the back. Passengers screamed and the scene plunged into chaos. It was too late. The attack was random, unprovoked, and brutal. Irina died on the train. Her final moments were recorded in a video that quickly spread online, sparking global outrage. Brown was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Soon after, federal prosecutors added an extra charge for causing a death on a public transport system, which opened the door to the death penalty. The public reaction was swift and fierce. Charlotte's mayor, Veit Lee, called the murder a shameful failure of the courts, admitting that Brown, given his long and violent criminal past, should have never been free. North Carolina's governor called for more police patrols. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy even threatened to pull $50 million in federal funds from Charlotte's transit, stating that if mayors couldn't keep trains safe, they didn't deserve taxpayer money. Even the president commented, calling the killing awful and a reminder that society must confront evil individuals. In Ukraine, the killing of a young woman who fled war only to be murdered in America caused deep sorrow and bewilderment. Her family statement called her a talented and devoted artist whose loss leaves a huge hole, but whose spirit will live on. Meanwhile, Brown's mother told local news that she had begged officials for mental health help for her son, fearing exactly this outcome if he was left untreated. Her pleas were ignored, and the consequences are now permanent. The murder of Irina Zaretska is more than just a crime. It's a stark symbol of broken systems, political fighting, and a justice system that allowed a violent repeat offender back on the street. A young woman who survived wartime bombs was killed on a train in North Carolina. The haunting question remains: how could Decarlos Brown Jr. have been free? Case 8. Basil Morgan. It wasn't his gaze, his stance, or even his face that grabbed your attention first. It was the ink. The words "Most Wanted" were scrawled crudely in black across his forehead. On his neck, the chilling phrase "Baby Nazi" appeared, and under his eye, a swastika was permanently set within a clover design. Where his eyebrows should have been, the symbols of white supremacy were tattooed. This man was Basil Morgan. By the time he appeared in a Las Vegas courtroom, he had made his body a walking declaration of hatred. Yet, his tattoos weren't the real danger. It was his actions. On May 2nd, 2013, 75-year-old Jean Main was home alone on Green Pasture Avenue, a quiet street in Las Vegas. She was a simple grandmother living a peaceful life, with no reason to think a horrific crime was about to enter her house. Prosecutors claimed Morgan broke in with a single motive: to rob her. But what happened next was brutal. He struck Jean with his pistol so hard that the gun's trigger guard broke.
Then, in an execution-style killing, he shot her in the back of the head. Her partner later found her, lifeless, face down on the bathroom floor. Morgan fled, taking a suitcase filled with Jean's items, a laptop, a Kindle Fire, $800 cash, and the keys to her Cadillac Escalade. His getaway driver, Keith Smith, later confessed that he panicked and drove off when the gunshots started, only to return moments later and see Morgan calmly lugging away the victim's belongings. When the police searched Morgan's residence, they recovered the stolen goods. They also found a grim portrait of the person Morgan had become. At just 18 years old, his booking photo showed a smooth face, clean of tattoos. But prison changed him completely. Behind bars, he cut his hateful beliefs into his own skin. Swastikas, slurs, and messages of racial hatred were inked in places no one could ignore. By the time of Jean Maine's murder, his appearance was more than just frightening. It was a challenge. And in court, this became a major issue. Could he get a fair trial when his face seemed to shout "monster" with every look? In a robbery case back in 2016, a judge had permitted Morgan to use heavy makeup to cover his tattoos, worried they would unfairly sway the jury. However, for the murder trial of Jean Maine, a different judge ruled against it. The tattoos would remain visible. Every juror, every witness, and every camera would see Basil Morgan exactly as he had decided to present himself. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the clear fact that a jury would never be able to look past his tattoos, Morgan took a plea bargain in 2017. He admitted his guilt to first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit burglary, and armed robbery. In return, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. They demanded a sentence of life in prison without parole. His defense team argued for a minimum of 21 years, but no sentence could undo the terrible violence he committed. A 75-year-old woman was pistol-whipped and executed in her own home for nothing more than the possessions she had spent her life earning. In the end, Basil Morgan wasn't just another criminal in Las Vegas. He became a painful example not only of violent hatred, but of a man who willingly transformed himself into the very embodiment of evil, until his body, his crimes, and his hateful beliefs were impossible to separate. In the process, the memory of his victim, Jean, risks being overshadowed. She was a grandmother who deserved quiet peace, not a life ended by a deliberate, vicious choice.
Daniel Lewis Lee's body spoke volumes before he ever opened his mouth. His tattoos, swastikas, numbers, and symbols of hate weren't just artwork. They were clear signs of his extreme beliefs. Adding to this unsettling look was his pale, lifeless white eye, a gaze that unnerved anyone who met it. Yet, his menacing appearance and ink didn't fully reveal the dark truth. Lee wasn't just intimidating to look at, he was defined by his actions. The world would soon witness the full horror of his true nature in a single, devastating night. William and Nancy Mueller, along with their daughter Sarah, lived a simple, quiet life that was about to tragically destroyed. Lee, with his partner Chevy Coe, approached their home with a motive deeper and colder than just robbery. It was about acting out an ideology rooted in hatred. The family inside had no idea what was coming. As they went through their normal evening routine, danger was already at their doorstep. Then the terror began. William fought back, Nancy pleaded, Sarah cried. But Lee and Coe were relentless. They tied up the family's hands and feet, quickly crushing any chance of resistance. The family's cozy home was suddenly a nightmare of suffocating fear. One by one, the family members were murdered by suffocation. William, Nancy, and Sarah, all silenced in their own home within minutes. Afterward, their bodies were taken out and thrown into a nearby bayou, hidden and left to decay in the murky water. One by one, 3 lives were wiped out in one night, leaving a community and the entire country deeply disturbed. By 1999, justice caught up with them. Coe received 3 life sentences. Lee was sentenced to death. For 21 years, he remained on federal death row, with his tattoos and striking eye serving as constant reminders of the monster he had become. On July 14, 2020, in Terre Haute, Indiana, Daniel Lewis Lee was executed by lethal injection. It was the first federal execution in 17 years. His final words were a claim of innocence. "I didn't do it. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, but I'm not a murderer. You're killing an innocent man." But the hard evidence, the brutal crime, and the hateful markings on his skin told a vastly different story. Daniel Lewis Lee, a man driven by hate, marked by his choices, and remembered forever for a night of unimaginable cruelty. Thank you for watching.